Welcome to the island nation called Nauru, spanning an area of barely 8 square miles and home to fewer than 11,000 residents. It ranks as the world's third tiniest country, surpassed solely by Monaco and Vatican City. Yet despite its extremely limited size, it certainly compensates in abundance through valuable economic teachings. For this tiny island nestled in the South Pacific witnessed one of history's harshest economic collapses. Previously, we have often discussed how natural resources can greatly influence the economies of numerous nations. Consider the enormous oil fortune possessed by several countries of the Persian Gulf. However, when handled without proper care, the wealth from natural resources may ultimately cause more harm than benefit over time. Hence, many economists often go as far as to describe it as the resource curse. This small island nation in the Pacific stands as arguably the clearest example of how things can completely fail. The nation rose from poverty to prosperity, only to later descend into conditions even worse than before it. Originally became wealthy, the story of Nauru provides a lesson from which every economist can learn something, as it remains one of history's few occasions when humans have managed to closely examine the economic systems that create such obvious cycles of boom and collapse. So how exactly did Nauru become the world's wealthiest nation? Which missteps did its leaders take that caused them to lose all this fortune? And in the end, how did this small country truly end up poorer over the long term? Europeans first came across Nauru back in 1789, when a British vessel sailed past a small island featuring a lush plateau in its center, blanketed with palm trees gently swaying and bordered by pristine white sandy shores. The island's breathtaking natural charm inspired the British to name it Pleasant Island. Several decades after that, the earliest foreigners established homes on Nauru, a land only one-third as large as Manhattan. At first, the island's natural supplies were believed to consist of pigs and coconuts. That was until one British geologist uncovered deposits of rich phosphate minerals. Simply put, the nation didn't strike oil riches. Instead, researchers discovered hardened bird droppings and algae, which surprisingly turned out more profitable since it was primarily used for fertilizers, yet also found use in cosmetics and feed. By the early years of the 20th century, during the time it was uncovered, 80% of Pleasant Island held this mineral, a bounty formed from centuries of seabird waste, blended together with tiny marine organisms, remaining unknown until that discovery. It may sound somewhat unpleasant, yet it was vital to feeding an expanding world population, making it exceptionally precious worldwide. Germany swiftly purchased the mining rights as they controlled Nauru as a colony. Then over the subsequent several years, nearly 80 million metric tons of this profitable mineral resource were shipped abroad from the little island. While ports and processing plants plus supporting trades emerged across a strip of land scarcely larger than New York's Central Park, Germany soon became occupied waging World War I, at which point Australia took the opportunity and captured Nauru under its own control. By that period, the island had merely turned into a distant mining outpost. Phosphate was largely traded at discounted prices, what Australians commonly refer to as mates rates, to agriculturalists across Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. Sadly, by this stage, decades of mining had already ruined most of Nauru's natural scenery. The upper portion of the island was then described in National Geographic as a dreadful wasteland. Quite the downfall from Pleasant Island. From here, it only gets worse. During the Second World War, Japan invaded the territory and unleashed horror upon Nauru, including forced labor camps and brutal drownings. By the war's conclusion, merely 600 Nauruans remained alive. After Japan's surrender and the conflict's end, the island was again returned to Australian hands, and their extraction of the island's foul riches resumed. Between 1945 and 1968, phosphate mining efforts reached unprecedented levels. When the Nauruans eventually gained independence, no one compelled them to continue mining phosphate. Yet by then, their entire economy had already become dependent on exporting that single resource. An independent Nauru had sacrificed one-third of its island to the pits, and its people now lived beside what had become a grotesque wasteland, a barren lunar field. All economies are restricted by their factors of production: land, labor, and capital, though in Nauru's situation, those limits were severe. The nation possessed a minute population, with little experience beyond hauling pungent rocks from the earth. Its small scale and remote location in the world meant most industries simply could not exist. And though phosphate extraction had once earned the country great fortune, the bulk of that wealth was taken by the powers that had colonized it. Lacking both infrastructure and expertise to grow new sectors, phosphate exports were increased. Further to squeeze every last drop of profit, they had no realistic means of succeeding in any other trade. It was already evident that the phosphate supply would vanish within a generation or two. Yet that didn't deter the Nauruans from justly claiming their portion of the wealth. This marked an era in Nauru's past that many referred to as the richest little island in the Pacific. Just over a decade after gaining independence, Nauru was internationally celebrated as the richest nation on Earth per person. In 1981, its GDP per capita stood at $27,000, equal to roughly $88,000 today. For comparison, the United States GDP per capita was $14,000 then. This meant the typical Nauruan was twice as wealthy as the average American. Of course, GDP per capita is hardly a flawless indicator of how well the average citizen is actually living. And if you'd like to understand GDP more deeply, check out this video on our second channel, Economics Explained Essentials. Though GDP per capita remains the simplest benchmark for comparing nations' economies and offers at least a rough picture of living standards. Thanks to abundant phosphate income and newfound independence, Nauru was finally thriving as a nation. Athletes are often told to retire at their greatest moment, and many Nauruans seem to take that advice to heart. After all, free education and healthcare were guaranteed by the government, and landowners earned handsome royalties from phosphate profits. Many citizens could afford unemployment by personal choice. Meanwhile, all sorts of unbelievable stories emerged in Nauru. Luxury cars became the ultimate status symbol. Despite the island's incredibly limited space, you can circle the island's entire coastline at a relaxed pace in about an hour, hardly the best location for high-speed racing. One police commissioner imported a Lamborghini to Nauru, only to discover he couldn't squeeze behind the wheel. His inability to drive his new luxury car was merely a glimpse of a worsening health disaster on the island. By 1980, a medical researcher identified Nauruans suffering from a full-scale obesity epidemic. The key drivers were newfound wealth and unhealthy diets. Consumption of processed junk food exploded, and even by 2002, the nation ranked dead last out of 170 countries, according to the World Health Organization. For average body mass index.A, Nauruans' life expectancy hovers only a little above 60. Traditional foods like fresh fish and coconuts were replaced almost entirely by imported goods, another lasting side effect of the mining era. The nation's declining health had devastating economic effects too. Suddenly, being too large to sit in a Lamborghini felt trivial compared with the broader human cost of this growing obesity epidemic. Let's take a closer look at Nauru's health crisis, both in the past and today. Most daily meals now consist of instant noodles, white rice, canned products, and sugary soft drinks. Smoking and heavy drinking are also widespread. Anthropologist Amy McLennan from the University of Oxford summed up her fieldwork by saying, "I was fortunate if I found one vegetable a week." Surprisingly, Nauruans are well educated and informed about the dangers linked to poor diets and obesity. There's no shortage of school programs promoting healthy eating. The true issue, however, lies in access to quality foods. Decades of relentless phosphate extraction ravaged the island's natural ecosystem so severely that farming became practically impossible. And, spoiler alert, once the phosphate industry collapsed, most Nauruans could only afford cheap processed imports. During colonial rule, locals received just a tiny portion of the fortune generated through phosphate exports. Given that history, it was more economic survival than greed that pushed them to keep mining after independence. Relying on imports for every necessity, including essentials like food and water, was never a sustainable way to live. Because all focus centered on phosphate extraction, no effort was devoted to farming or manufacturing. Agriculture was futile regardless. Since mining had stripped away the island's fertile topsoil, this became a textbook example of Dutch disease. But taken to a devastating extreme due to the already scarce resources of Nauru's fragile economy, one way to avoid Dutch diseases through broad diversification of industries. This method is visible in many Middle Eastern nations that actively attempt to expand their economies. You can explore that further in our recent video discussing the economies behind the Gulf states' colossal megaprojects. Whether those projects ultimately succeed remains a topic of ongoing debate, but at least those nations are trying. The urgency to diversify wasn't news to Nauru's political leadership, and they genuinely sought out alternative ventures. One such attempt was offshore banking, which granted licenses to nearly 400 foreign banks by the start of the 1990s. These Nauruan financial operations began as a success, but the underlying business model was, to put it mildly, highly questionable. Clients were never required to visit the island to create or manage their accounts. Through the offer of economic citizenship, anyone could easily acquire a Nauruan passport, turning the island into a haven for tax evasion and money laundering schemes. The government profited handsomely from application fees, yet it did little to secure Nauru's long-term stability once phosphate revenues had completely dried up. By 2005, the offshore banking system was shut down, and the nation began demanding physical operations for new banking licenses. This wasn't out of ethical reform, but rather intense international pressure, with the United States even labeling Nauru a rogue state under the Patriot Act of 2001. Another solution to counter Dutch disease was the so-called Norwegian model, to establish a sovereign wealth fund that invests natural resource profits sustainably to benefit future generations, indefinitely. A portion of Nauru's phosphate wealth had indeed been invested overseas, intended for the day their riches disappeared. The idea itself was sound in theory, but its execution was disastrously poor. Speculative deals and outright corruption wiped out much of the nation's fortune, pushing Nauru dangerously close to bankruptcy. Even after finding new phosphate deposits and sparking a brief second mining boom, the island's economic collapse was unavoidable. The nation went entirely bankrupt. Even its central bank ceased functioning. Foreign governments seized Nauru's properties abroad, and its commercial aircraft were confiscated. Yes, Nauru had its own airline, launched in the 1970s. There was, however, one last desperate gamble to restore financial stability. Nauru infamously funded one of London's worst flops in theater history, Leonardo, the musical, A Portrait of Love. The play dramatized a fictional romance between Leonardo da Vinci, Mona Lisa, and a soldier. Unsurprisingly, it bombed spectacularly just when Nauru could not afford a single misstep. By 2001, their phosphate reserves were gone, and nearly all foreign investments had collapsed. At that stage, the nation was utterly bankrupt, its GDP just $32 million when adjusted, unemployment soaring to 90%, and the education system nearly disintegrated. Hard to believe this was once the wealthiest country in the entire world. Tragically, this marked only the start of one of Nauru's darkest modern chapters. That same year, the Norwegian freighter MV Tampa attempted to dock on Australian shores. Its crew had rescued more than 400 mostly Afghan refugees from a sinking vessel. Australia refused entry to the Tampa, instead devising the Pacific solution, an offshore detention center based in Nauru. In return for detaining asylum seekers, Australia paid Nauru generous sums of money, creating local jobs and strange new dynamics. But Nauru had no means to decline the deal. its dependence on Australian aid far too deep. Even fierce resistance from Nauru's citizens could not overturn this controversial arrangement. Over the last 2 decades, Australia has repeatedly relied on Nauru's detention facilities, a relationship that continues to this day. Combined with steady inflows of foreign aid, mostly from Australia, these payments have barely managed to keep Nauru's fragile economy alive. James Angamea, a long-serving minister of the Nauru Congregational Church, born in 1911, lived through nearly every chapter of this story, even the infamous musical. He once told the New York Times, "I wish we'd never discovered that phosphate. I wish Nauru could look like it did when I was a boy. It was so beautiful. There were trees. It was green everywhere, and we could eat fresh coconuts and breadfruit. Now I see what's happened here, and I want to cry." Now it's time to place Nauru on the Economics Explained National Leaderboard. Starting with size, Nauru's GDP stands at just 133 million, making it the world's 3rd smallest economy, ahead only of Montserrat and Tuvalu. Given its limited scale, Nauru earns a 1 out of 10. That small GDP is shared among a population of just over 10,000 citizens. As of 2021, the GDP per capita was about $12,000, roughly matching the global average. That earns Nauru a 5 out of 10. When it comes to stability and confidence, Nauru's poor handling of its phosphate fortune, its experiment with offshore banking, and its reliance on controversial detention center policies have all damaged its credibility. For that reason, it scores a 3 out of 10. Growth, however, tells a more complex story. During the 1970s and 1980s, Nauru's phosphate boom made it the richest nation on Earth. But after the reserves were exhausted in the 1990s, its GDP collapsed by more than 90%. Since then, the economy has rebounded impressively, growing at an average of 7% per year, driven almost entirely by detention services and foreign aid. Even so, 7% annual growth is remarkable. So Nauru earns a 9 out of 10. Finally, Industry.Today, Nauru's main economic engine is its outsourced refugee detention centers. While this provides substantial short-term income, it fails to build the skills or technology base needed for sustainable, long-term development once that revenue dries up. Thus, Nauru receives a 2 out of 10. Altogether, that gives Nauru an average score of 4 out of 10, placing it near the lower end of the Economics Explained National Leaderboard. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye. Bye.